Imagine working a full month, never missing a single day, and barely earning enough to buy one pair of brand name sneakers. That's how a huge part of the population lives in Bangladesh, a country of almost 175 million people, where millions survive on less than $2 a day. This is a place with cities so packed that walking down the street feels like swimming against the current. Children who work instead of going to school, and an entire country that could end up underwater within a few decades. Let me make you a promise. Fact number 1 on this list is going to surprise you, because out of the harshest poverty on earth came an idea that today changes the lives of millions of people. Stay until the end. And if you like discovering the most fascinating countries on the planet, subscribe right now, because we're exploring the world corner by corner. Fact 10. The most crowded capital on the planet, Dhaka, the capital of Bangladesh, is probably one of the most crowded cities on earth. We're talking about more than 24 million people living in its metro area, and inside the densest part of the city, the number is somewhere around 60,000 people per square mile. To give you an idea of what that number actually means, imagine taking every single resident of a mid-sized city, squeezing all of them into the space of a football stadium, and telling them they now have to live, sleep, cook, and work in there at the same time. The streets of Dhaka are packed with a form of transport that became a symbol of the entire country, the cycle rickshaw. That brightly painted three-wheeler that one single man moves with nothing but his legs, pedaling under a sun that in the hottest months easily passes 95 degrees Fahrenheit. It's estimated that hundreds of thousands of people make their living exclusively by pedaling these rickshaws from one side of the city to the other, all day long, carrying passengers, vegetables, furniture, whatever needs moving, just to earn a handful of dollars by the end of the day. And here's the fascinating part of all this. Dhaka grows so fast because every single year, hundreds of thousands of people arrive from the countryside, escaping floods, droughts, and the total lack of work back in their home villages. Almost a third of that population ends up living in informal settlements. Houses built out of corrugated metal, bamboo and cloth, packed against each other in alleyways so narrow that only one person can pass at a time, very often with no guaranteed clean water and no reliable electricity. It's a city that never stops growing, because as hard as it is to believe, for millions of people, even the toughest life in the capital is still better than staying behind with absolutely nothing in their village. It's the promise of an opportunity, even if that opportunity comes at an enormous cost. And the strange thing is that in the middle of all that chaos of traffic, noise, and people everywhere, Dhaka is also a city with an energy that is impossible to ignore. Markets that smell of spices from early in the morning, vendors shouting out the price of fresh fish, and millions of separate stories crossing paths every single day on the same street corner, all of them chasing the same thing, keeping their family going for one more day. It's not unusual to hear that someone has spent 15 years pedaling the same rickshaw, learning every street, every shortcut, and every pothole in a city that never stops moving, not even at 4 in the morning. Some drivers even sleep inside their own rickshaw, parked on some corner, because the trip back to their own neighborhood would cost them hours of sleep they simply can't afford to lose. Fact 9. Clothes made for $3 a day. You are probably wearing something right now that was sewn in Bangladesh without even knowing it. The country is the second largest clothing exporter in the world, behind only China, and that garment industry employs millions of people, most of them young women who came from the countryside looking for something different from working their family's land. The problem, as you can probably guess, is the pay. The official minimum wage for a garment worker in Bangladesh comes out to a little over $100 a month. That's roughly $3.50 for a full day of work inside a factory, often in suffocating heat, and often for hours that stretch well beyond what the contract says. Labour unions and international organisations have spent years demanding a serious raise because with the inflation of recent years, that money barely covers basic food and a small rented room in a city as expensive as Dhaka. Many workers end up in debt before their next payday even arrives, borrowing from neighbours or relatives just to get food on the table for the last week of the month. And the hardest part is that most of these workers are between 18 and 30 years old, many of them with small children waiting at home, looked after by a grandmother or a neighbour, while they spend 10 or 12 hours standing in front of a sewing machine. And even though the minimum wage has been raised several times in recent years, every raise arrives with inflation that eats up almost all of the real gain. So in practice, a lot of workers feel like they're standing in exactly the same place they always were, just with different numbers written on paper. Many of them walk more than an hour every single day, there and back, because they can't even spare the bus fare inside such a tight budget. Some share a single room between 4 or 5 co-workers, taking turns on the bed depending on each person's shift, just to save a little more and send something home to their parents in the countryside. And here I want to ask you something direct. If you knew for a fact that the clothes you're wearing right now were sewn by someone earning barely $3 a day, would it change anything about the way you buy clothes? Leave your answer down in the comments. I genuinely want to read what you think about this. And while you're at it, if this kind of story makes you stop and think, hit the like button. It helps a lot in getting this video in front of more people. Fact 8. Dressing the world, earning almost nothing. Clothing doesn't just define a big part of Bangladesh's economy. It literally defines who survives inside the country and who doesn't. Almost half of everything Bangladesh sells to the rest of the world comes out of these garment factories, which makes the country a key piece inside the big fashion brands you almost certainly know and that you probably have hanging in your closet right now. But here's the deeper problem. When demand for clothing drops somewhere on the planet, or the cost of producing goes up for any economic reason at all, these same factories are the first ones to cut staff without warning. In recent years alone, it's estimated that more than 150,000 jobs in this sector were put at direct risk because international orders fell, leaving entire families without the income that was holding the household together. And here's what's genuinely interesting to think about. An entire economy, with almost 175 million people depending on it in one way or another, is largely tied to whether clothing stores on other continents keep buying at the same pace. It's a chain so long and so invisible that it starts at a sewing machine in a neighbourhood of Dhaka and ends in the closet of someone living thousands of miles away, very often without that person knowing anything at all about the real story behind the item they just bought on sale. It's strange to think about it that way. A decision made in a design office on the other side of the world about lowering prices or switching suppliers ends up deciding whether an entire family in a Dhaka neighbourhood can pay their rent that month or not. That distance, so enormous and so invisible at the same time, is one of the hardest things to see with the naked eye when we talk about the clothes we wear every day. And still, that same invisible thread is what keeps entire factories running, thousands of machines switched on before sunrise, sewing the same garment over and over until the daily order is done. Fact 7. The millions who leave. Millions of Bangladeshis literally leave the country, leaving their families behind in order to support them from a distance with what they earn abroad. In the last recorded year alone, more than 1.1 million people left Bangladesh to work overseas. Most of them headed to countries like Saudi Arabia, Qatar or Singapore, doing construction, cleaning, security or domestic work, very often under contracts that barely guarantee them basic rights. And here comes a number that's genuinely staggering. In one recent year, these migrant workers sent home more than $32 billion in remittances, the highest figure ever recorded in the country's history. To put it in simple terms, that money arriving from abroad is one of the biggest engines of the entire Bangladeshi economy, more important than plenty of industries that exist inside the country itself. The reason behind this is painful, but completely logical when you think it through. When there isn't enough decent work inside the country, the only real way out left for millions of families is for one member to travel far away, often for years at a time, so the rest of the family can eat properly, pay for the younger kids' schooling, or simply keep a secure roof over their heads. It's an entire generation holding up their country from another continent, very often without being able to hug their wife, their children, or their parents for years in a row, communicating through a video call in the little free time left at the end of an exhausting shift. So we've lived in Dubai now for 2 years, and we made the decision to come to Dubai for two reasons. So we've lived in Dubai now for 2 years, and we made the decision to come to Dubai for two reasons. On the silent sacrifice of being far away so that the ones who stayed can live a little better. Many of those workers don't even meet their youngest child in person until they come back years later for a few short weeks of vacation. And when they finally do come home, they often find a child who already walks, who already talks, who grew up completely while they were working thousands of miles away trying to make it possible. Fact 6. The sea that keeps advancing. The sea is literally eating Bangladesh. So almost the entire country is built on a giant river delta, the land formed by the Ganges, the Brahmaputra and the Meghna, right before they empty into the sea, which means a huge part of the territory sits just a few feet above the waterline. Scientists who study this closely calculate that if sea levels keep rising at the current pace, by the middle of this century the country could lose around 13% of its territory in the southern zone, and that would force somewhere between 15 and 20 million people to move, purely because of rising water. Even today, hundreds of thousands of people every year have to abandon their homes because of flooding, storms that keep getting stronger, or because salt water from the sea is ruining the land where they used to grow rice for generations. There are women who have had to move 3 or 4 times over the course of their lives, because the river simply took their land from one moment to the next, dragging away the house, the animals, and everything they'd built over years of effort. The Sundarbans mangrove forest, that enormous forest protecting the southern coast and the only natural home of the Bengal tiger, is also losing ground little by little against the constant advance of salt water, something that's also hurting the fishing and the honey production that thousands of families in that region live on. Think about this. 2/3 of the entire territory of Bangladesh sits less than 16 feet above sea level, roughly the height of a 2-story building. So any rise in the water, however small it looks on a map, translates into entire villages underwater within hours whenever a strong storm rolls in from the Bay of Bengal. Bangladesh sits right between India and Myanmar, in the exact zone where several of the biggest rivers in Asia finish emptying all their water into the sea. And that same location explains both the fertility of its soil and the constant threat that the water represents. Here's the second question of this video, and I want you to think about it seriously. Can you imagine having to leave your home forever? Not because of a war, not because of a conflict between people, but simply because the sea decided to keep your land. Tell me in the comments what you would feel in that situation. And if you haven't done it yet, take a second to hit like on this video. It genuinely helps get these stories in front of more people. Fact 5. Children with no childhood. In Bangladesh, close to 2 million children between the ages of 5 and 17 work instead of going to school. Many of them do it in dangerous jobs, informal garment workshops with no safety measures at all, heavy agricultural labor under the sun all day, or domestic work inside other people's homes, very often with no real legal protection to keep them safe from abuse. Recent official surveys show that the number of working children has actually gone up in recent years, partly because the poorest families need every available pair of hands at home just to survive day to day, with no margin left to think about the long term. The reason behind this is simple and sad at the same time. When a family doesn't have enough to eat, sending a child to work stops being a difficult decision and becomes an immediate necessity that tonight's dinner depends on. Education, which in theory should be the natural way out of poverty, ends up being a luxury that many families still can't afford. And so the cycle repeats itself generation after generation, almost without anyone actually choosing it. There are children barely 8 or 9 years old helping out in metal recycling workshops, breathing smoke all day, or hauling loads in the markets of Dhaka that weigh almost as much as they do. Simply because that extra coin at the end of the day is the difference between eating rice with something else or eating only rice. Some of these kids don't even remember having a single full day of play because from a very young age they understood that they had to help at home, with no exceptions and no vacations. International organizations have pushed programs to pull them out of the most dangerous jobs and get them back into a classroom. But changing the economic reality of an entire family takes far longer than any program can fix in a few months. Fact 4. Almost half of the country can't read properly. Recent surveys show that more than 40% of the adult population of Bangladesh never even finished 5th grade, and a significant chunk of that percentage never set foot in a school in their entire life. The government has been running literacy programs for more than 3 decades, with steady investment and campaigns in rural areas, and yes, the situation has improved enormously compared to 50 years ago. But the education gap is still huge, especially among older women and in rural areas far from the big cities. The fascinating part of all this is that the lack of education isn't just an individual problem for each person, it's a massive brake on the entire country. Without reading well, without writing comfortably, and without handling basic math, it's far harder for someone to climb out of badly paid work and finally break the cycle of family poverty. And still, in the middle of all this, there's something beautiful worth recognizing. Every new generation of Bangladeshi girls gets further in secondary school than their own mothers ever did. A slow improvement, but a completely real and measurable one over the years. In some villages, going to school still means walking more than an hour under the sun, crossing bamboo bridges over water channels, just to reach a classroom that sometimes doesn't even have complete walls. And even so, every morning hundreds of thousands of boys and girls make that walk with their hopes pinned on education, actually changing their lives, even though it never changed their parents' lives. Some rural teachers handle more than 60 students in a single classroom, with an old chalkboard and textbooks that already passed through several generations of students before reaching their hands. And even under those conditions, many of those same teachers have spent decades teaching for terrible pay, simply because they truly believe that educating one more child is the only real way to change the future of an entire village. Fact 3. Gardens that float. In the most flooded parts of the country, Bangladeshi farmers invented, generations ago, a way of growing food that looks like it came from another planet. Floating gardens use water hyacinth, an aquatic plant that grows on its own in huge quantities, and combine it with bamboo and layers of soil to build platforms that literally float on top of the floodwater. Right there they plant vegetables, spices, and even rice. All of it floating on what used to be nothing but stagnant water, useless for any kind of harvest. It's a technique that's been passed down generation after generation in the lowest lying parts of the country. And today, climate researchers from all over the world study it closely as a real, working example of how an entire population can adapt to a planet that's changing faster than anyone expected. The reason behind this invention is pure survival instinct put into practice. When your land disappears underwater for several months every year, either you find another way to grow food, or you simply stop having food for your family. And this is a nearly perfect example of how, even in the middle of so much hardship, people's creativity always finds a way out, however unbelievable it sounds from the outside. Picture yourself rowing a small canoe between your own crops, harvesting vegetables straight out of the water, while everything around you is still flooded. That's agriculture literally floating on top of the problem that's threatening it. An image that perfectly sums up the spirit of an entire country used to living alongside the water instead of constantly fighting against it. There are entire families today who depend almost completely on these floating platforms during the rainiest months, when solid ground simply stops existing around them. So we've lived in Dubai now for 2 years, and we made the decision to come to Dubai for two reasons. And at the time, that was completely true. Between the year 2000 and relatively recently, more than 30 million people managed to climb out of extreme poverty thanks to steady, sustained economic growth over many years. But more recently, that story took a worrying turn that very few people saw coming. Recent World Bank studies show that poverty has clearly risen again, reaching almost 23% of the population, according to the government's own official figures. Although independent research points to numbers even higher than that, closer to 28% of the entire country. That means tens of millions of people who had already managed to get ahead are today right back on the edge of falling into extreme poverty again, some of them for the second time in their lives. The reason behind this reversal has several culprits acting at the same time. The runaway inflation of recent years that pushed up the price of basic food, the loss of jobs in the garment industry as international orders dropped, the political instability the country went through after an abrupt change of government not long ago, and the growing impact of climate change on traditional agriculture. It's a brutal lesson for any country in the world. Poverty is not a battle you win once and then consider permanently solved. It's a constant fight that can be lost all over again if things go wrong on several fronts at the same time. Families who just a few years ago had managed to buy a small motorbike or send their kids to a modest private school are today back to counting every cup of rice, cutting meals, or selling off the little they built over the last decade just to get through one more month. It's an uncomfortable reminder that progress, when it isn't protected by solid policy, can disappear almost as fast as it arrived. Local economists insist that the only way to reverse this trend is to create stable jobs inside the country, so that millions of families stop depending exclusively on a single industry or on one relative working abroad. Fact 1. The $27 that changed everything. In the middle of all this very real poverty, something was born in this exact country that today helps millions of people across dozens of completely different nations around the world. It all started in 1976, in a small village called Jobra, when an economics professor named Muhammad Yunus came across a group of women who made bamboo furniture with their own hands, but who never got to keep the real profit from their work, because they depended on local moneylenders charging them interest rates so high they were almost impossible to pay off. Yunus did something that at the time struck everyone around him as insane. He pulled the equivalent of $27 out of his own pocket and lent it, with no abusive interest and no collateral required, to 42 women in that village. That tiny loan changed those families' lives almost immediately, and that simple idea later became Grameen Bank, the first bank in the world designed exclusively to lend money to the poorest people without demanding any material guarantee, something no traditional bank would have dared to do up to that point. Today, that bank has more than 10 million active clients, almost all of them women, and it has lent out more than $40 billion over the course of its history, with a repayment rate even higher than that of many traditional banks around the world. In 2006, Muhammad Yunus and Grameen Bank jointly received the Nobel Peace Prize for this idea, and since then, the microcredit model has been replicated in more than 100 countries around the planet, helping millions of people who never could have walked into a normal bank and gotten a loan. The reason behind all this is, for me, the most beautiful part of this entire list. In the same country where millions of people survive today on less than $2 a day, one of the most powerful tools that exists anywhere in the world for fighting poverty was also born. Bangladesh isn't just a place where poverty happens every day. It's also the place where somebody decided to invent a real, proven way to fight it, starting with barely $27 out of his own pocket and an enormous amount of faith in the people nobody else wanted to help. And the most beautiful part of the story is that almost every loan, from day one until now, nearly 4 decades later, has gone to women, many of them unable to read, many of them having never had a bank account in their own name. And still, with a repayment rate that would make any bank on Wall Street proud. Sometimes the most powerful solution against poverty doesn't come from a giant building in a financial capital. It comes from a small, forgotten village with a professor walking between bamboo houses with $27 in his hand. And maybe that's the most important lesson of this entire video. Even in the place where getting ahead looks hardest, there is always someone looking for a way to change everything, even if they start with almost nothing. So that's real life in Bangladesh, a country that packs almost 175 million people into a tiny stretch of land that suffers flooding every single year, with poverty that rises and falls, and a climate that keeps getting more hostile over time. But that's also, at the same time, a birthplace of ingenuity, of daily resilience, and of solutions the rest of the world ends up copying on other continents. It's a country of brutal contrasts, where the same land that drowns its people has also taught them how to float, both literally and symbolically, generation after generation. It's not a country you can sum up in a single sentence, and maybe that's exactly why it's worth getting to know slowly, fact by fact, story by story, instead of settling for the quick image we sometimes catch on the news. If you enjoyed getting to know a story this real and this rarely told, subscribe right now so you can join us for the next country we discover together. Because on this channel there's always a true story waiting to be told, and the next one might surprise you even more than this one.